For the second hour, we are featuring Gary King and the new JFK Show. We've been reviewing clips from Evidence of Revision, which is a fantastic compilation of clips with no commentary, just let them speak for themselves. And here we'll be commenting on a whole lot of them. Gary, take it away.
All right, here we go. First of all, the crowd was cheering on Houston Street as they were waiting for Oswald to be transferred.
Yeah, we're outside of the courthouse where a crowd of several hundred had gathered, awaiting the arrival of Lee Harvey Oswald. 10 blocks away at City Hall, that arrival stopped by apparently a bullet. This crowd, when word flashed through the crowd that Oswald had been shot, broke out into a cheer. The crowd has been dispersing for the past 5 minutes, many of them just getting the news. What's your reaction to hearing that suspect Oswald has been shot down?
Well, I can't hardly say what right now, but I think that people wanted a quick decision on his execution and get him put away.
Cheering the execution of Oswald.
Well, Gary, obviously it means the propaganda, the onslaught by the news, CBS, NBC, ABC primarily, had been powerfully effective in convincing people of what had yet to be established to it, that Oswald was in fact the lone assassin of JFK. Anyone who's ever studied the case realizes how much of a fiction were those reports, but nevertheless they were the source of an induced belief in a large proportion of the population, which took for granted that what they were hearing from the national news channels was true.
So they were under a huge psyop. Did Oswald know Jack Ruby?
We're in the studio, WFAA News Director Bob Walker. Bob, what's new?
Just learned from City Hall from a very authoritative source that police are working on the assumption that there indeed is a connection between Jack Ruby and Lee Oswald, and that in some manner of speaking, Oswald's murder was to shut him up.
Hey, Dr. Fetzer.
Well, it's very interesting because, of course, even as Judith Berry Baker has reported, she and Lee knew Sparky Rubenstein in New Orleans when they were collaborating with David Ferry and Dr. Mary Sherman in the production of a rapid-acting cancer-inducing inoculation, which, ironically, would eventually be used on Jack Ruby himself. But she has spoken of going to meet Carlos Marcello, where Sparky was with them. And believe it or not, she was, horrified by Lee being killed, and it was quite some time thereafter, since you don't actually see clearly the face of the man who performed the shooting, and she knew him not as Jack Ruby, but as Sparky Rubenstein, before she came to the agonizing realization that she actually knew the man who had killed the man she loved.
Just unbelievable. All right, the FBI is not releasing any information leading to the reason why they suspected Oswald so heavily.
Also, they have said that they will not release in the immediate future at all any of the information the FBI has gathered which led them to believe so strongly that Oswald had assassinated the president.
Well, of course they aren't going to release it. I mean, too many people would realize it was fabricated or fake, such as the backyard photographs. I mean, even the weapon was mailed in the name of Alec Heidel, but since the mailbox was in the name of Lee Harvey Oswald, it could not have been officially, properly delivered to his mailbox, which is just one more indication. Of course, he passed his nitrate test, showing that he had no nitrates on his cheeks, which indicated he'd not fired a rifle or a carbine. He did have nitrates on his hand, which was doubly exculpatory, because if he'd washed the nitrates off his cheeks at the same time, he would have washed them off his hands, and having nitrates on his hands was a perfectly predictable consequence of him working in a book depository, because books are printed in ink which is loaded with nitrates. So, and even if they went back to the arrest report, which is dated 1:40 in the afternoon, it states this man shot and killed President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit and wounded Governor John Connally. I mean, how absurd for an arrest report on a man who ostensibly was being brought in because he hadn't paid for a ticket when he entered the theater, which had evoked the most massive response in force. About a dozen or more police vehicles and detectives and so forth for any minor offense in American criminal history. That, you know, it's so obvious that this was a fraud, this was a frame, and it was being performed by a group about as competent as the Marx Brothers or the Three Stooges.
I just have to play that clip again where they just say they will not release the info.
Also, they have said that they will not release in the immediate future at all any of the information the FBI has gathered which led them to believe so strongly that Oswald had assassinated the president.
All right, this is just a commentator saying, when will we know it really happened?
Adding, Bob, I might have taken place in Dallas the past few days would certainly indicate that there were no clear-cut defining points involved in the initial assassination. Now, this only compounds it. It will be remarkable to find, when the story is eventually known, what actually did happen.
Comment on that one?
Well, Gary, it's just par for the course. I mean, early students such as Harold Weisberg would sort out basically what had happened as early as 1966 and 67 when he was publishing his Whitewash series, and other various students of the case would also be sorting things out. Others were offering the pretense of doing that, but in fact were involved in covering it up, including, sad to say, Josiah Thompson, whose 6 Seconds in Dallas actually abounded with evidence of conspiracy, but where in the final paragraph he stated falsely that nothing in his book proved that a conspiracy had taken place, even though he had Robert McClellan's diagram of the massive blowout at the back of the head, and he had a very fine analysis of the double hit theory, where JFK's head goes forward between frames 312 and 313 and then violently back and to the left in 14, 15, 16, and 17 and so forth. So, I mean, and there was just a whole lot more there, yet he claimed at the end that none of this proved a conspiracy, which led Vince Salandria, who was among the most perceptive of the early students of the assassination, to nail him as some kind of operative engaged in a cover-up. He sought to slough it off, Josiah did, by saying it was just a matter of the phrasing of language, but for crying out loud, the man's a PhD in philosophy from Yale. He knows the meaning of words.
Did Jack Ruby say how he got into this basement here today?
He didn't tell me that.
Did he say he had planned it for a while, Captain?
There's some of those things I can't answer for you, and he, of course, has talked to an attorney, and there's certain things that he don't want to tell me.
What happened here today?
All right, Fritz hasn't said one word. Either he's smart or, I just don't know what to make Will Fritz.
Well, I don't think Will Fritz was a very bright bulb, frankly. They touted him, they played him up. They inflated his stature to try to make him out to be, some kind of wizard as an investigator, but he seems to me he was merely a stooge. He was simply playing a role and didn't do it all that well in the end, in my view.
Mm-hmm. Jack Ruby, breaching the security.
The ring of security was broken by a man who lunged out between photographers and shot the man who was accused of killing the president. He's going to be taken upstairs to the jail. They've opened the door and he's going to the jail elevator. This is the first interrogation down here on the 3rd floor by members of the homicide squad. Again, this scene very similar to scenes we've seen before, repeated yesterday and the day before.
You are one of... Yeah, it was exactly when they brought Oswald the day before, bringing him right in the elevator. Same scenario.
Yeah, well, they were parading him around. They were trying to make it look as though they were doing something serious, when, of course, they were not. It was merely window dressing. I mean, they already knew they had their man, just as either Walter Jenkins or LBJ himself had called Henry Wade to advise him not to talk about the possibility of a conspiracy, which he actually had done right off the bat. And just as he had called Will Fritz to tell him that he had his man, they were merely performing, stage props, window dressing. It was nothing significant. They knew they had their man.
Jack Ruby, is it safe? This is his lawyer, Tom Howard, talking about, is it safe if you're Jack Ruby?
We discussed the case to this extent that I advised him of his rights and what he should do and should not do, and he said he would follow my instructions to the best of his ability.
Are you worried about his safety?
Well, a man would have to be worried about his safety after the things that have happened here in the last 2 or 3 days.
Lawyer Tom Howard, interviewed by ABC's Bill Lord. We understand that he has been selected as at least one of the defense counselors to serve for Jack Ruby, who has already been formally charged with first-degree murder in the death today of Lee Harvey Oswald.
All right, what do you say about Ruby's lawyer, Tom Howard?
Well, he sounds like a halfway decent guy. I mean, obviously anyone ought to be profoundly concerned under these circumstances with the situation and the possible death of Jack Ruby as well. I mean, this whole thing is quite preposterous. And notice how quickly they charged Jack Ruby with the death of Lee Oswald and how reticent they had been about charging Lee Oswald with the death of JFK. They clearly intended to keep Lee in the dark as long as possible so he couldn't speak out about his role or his innocence in relation to the shooting of JFK. But, of course, everyone knew Jack Ruby had shot Lee, so there was no reason for any pretense there.
What do you think they were telling Ruby at the time?
I think Jack was under a threat that if he didn't do this, he'd die a terrible death. I don't know if you've ever watched Once Upon a Time in America. Okay. At the end of Once Upon a Time in America, for example, it turns out that the anti-hero has has been threatened with death for having to climb into the back of a trash truck, a garbage truck, and be mangled if his longtime former friend, he appeals to his longtime former friend to kill him, but played by Robert De Niro, who declines. And at the end, you see him going out and climbing in the back of the garbage truck, and you hear the breaking bones. Well, that wouldn't be a pleasant death for anyone. I think Jack Ruby confronted that kind of an alternative. Either you shoot Oswald or you climb in the back of a garbage truck.
All right, Tom Howard saying that Ruby did not know Oswald.
These events, these bizarre, frightening, strange, unbelievable events have overshadowed somewhat another major story in Dallas.
Possibility, Mr. Howard, that there was some connection between Oswald and Ruby, that they had met or knew each other.
There is that wild rumor going around. So far as I know, and so far as I am concerned, I don't think there's a bit of truth in that.
A performer at Mr. Ruby's club said that he thought he saw Oswald there some days ago.
I think he was mistaken.
All right, Dr. Fetzer, what do you say?
Well, Henry Wade had to know because, half the cops in Dallas hung out at the Carousel Club, where Beverly Oliver, who was a singer at another club, had come over on one occasion, and she explained this on Jesse Ventura's America when she and I and Aubrey Reich were featured on a show he had. He only had about 7 episodes, but he had one on JFK that was actually very good, where she explained about watching JFK's brains be blown out in Dealey Plaza through her camera viewer, how Aubrey Reich confirmed the blood at the back of the head, which he felt when he helped to lift the body, which was wrapped in sheets and towels into the bronze ceremonial casket. And where I explained how they had concealed it by patching it, and so that the X-rays had been forged, and David Manick had been able to ascertain how it had been done using a simple technique from physics known as optical densitometry. But where Beverly explained, too, on this occasion, how she had come into the Carousel Club and Jack Ruby had called her over and said, Beverly, I want you to meet my friend Lee Oswald of the CIA. And Beverly said she didn't know what that meant then, and even on the occasion of this television appearance, still didn't know what that meant. But what it tells us in the broader scheme of things is not only did they know each other, and I've already explained how they knew each other in New Orleans, which we learned from Judith Very Baker, but that Lee had been a familiar feature at the Carousel Club, and Henry Wade himself had to know. So this is just part and parcel of the cover-up, where the Dallas police and the Dallas sheriff and the Dallas DA played integral parts in framing an innocent man.
All right, here's a very, very obscure question. Does Jack know that he may have messed up history as far as knowing the truth?
Realize that what he's done perhaps create a question for the rest of history whether who killed President Jackson.
Can you explain why during his presence here prior to the shooting he must have been within close proximity of Oswald, but apparently that never showed any emotional outbursts or never said anything? He was here at times when it is believed that Oswald would have passed him by. He was around a group of people. Now, did this build up, this emotional?
I'm sure it's built up over a period of several days.
I'm going to represent him in the manner that I think is for his best interest.
What is his best interest?
Yeah, everybody laughing about his best interest. All right, take us out with this one, that he had plenty of opportunity to shoot Lee Oswald.
Well, he did. I mean, it was a very nice setup, and as I have explained previously, but it's worthy of reiteration, those who think that it had to be an incredible coincidence that Jack Ruby would have been in position because they were delayed in the timing of taking Lee out to make a completely unnecessary transfer to another cell. They were waiting for Jack Ruby before they moved him. I mean, you got to understand how to think these things through. It wasn't that Jack Ruby was incredibly fortuitous in having a chance to shoot Lee Oswald because they were moving him late. They were delaying moving him at all until Jack Ruby was in a position to shoot him.
All right, this is The Real Deal with Dr. Jim Fetzer, adding the commentary to revision of evidence that is absent in this magnificent collection of videos and news clips. This is The Real Deal. We'll be right back after some good Beatles music and a couple of ads. All right, welcome back to The Real Deal. This is Jim Fetzer commentating on revision of evidence. This is a great, great series, and we're going to start off with Jada.
And now the headliner of our show, direct from New Orleans. Ladies and gentlemen, Jada!
Jada, how long did you know Jack Ruby?
I knew Jack Ruby for approximately 4, 5, 6 months.
In what relationship?
I was employed as the feature at the Carousel Club, and I had known Jack before I went to work there, and I had a slight hassle with Jack, and I had left, and that was the end of my association with Jack.
What about politics? Did he seem interested in politics, particularly regarding the Kennedys?
I have heard Jack talk about the Kennedys, and I've been trying to think, and it's so confusing today, but I believe he disliked Bobby Kennedy.
No recollection of what he had ever said about the president?
Yes, he followed that statement up about Bobby with something about Jack Kennedy, but I can't, for the minute, just form it in my mind.
Do you think that Jack Ruby is the type of man that was capable of killing the assassin of President Kennedy out of love for Kennedy, out of political motives?
I don't think he loved Kennedy that much. I don't know why he would do it. I'd say he would be perfectly capable of an act like that. Very much so.
But the reasons for it, those are hard to pin down, as the portrait of Jack Ruby emerges piece by piece.
Yeah, big clue there. Straight out of New Orleans is Jada.
Yeah, it was Jada who was one of his dancers, one of the strippers for Jack Ruby, and she pauses and hesitates, but you know that Jack Ruby bore no affection for either Bobby or Jack. Bobby was very much on the minds of the mobsters because, of course, as Attorney General, he was cracking down on the mafia. He had even taken, a mobster and dropped him in the middle of the jungle in Guatemala to find his way back. I mean, they were furious with Bobby, and they bore no affection for Jack, and would later discuss whether they should have hit Bobby instead of hitting Jack. But the consensus at the time was that if you if you took out the president, then his brother would be basically powerless, which of course turned out to be the case, since he was sandwiched in between J. Edgar, his nominal subordinate, and LBJ, his superior. Bobby was politically impotent. There was not a thing he could do about it, and those who believed that because he was still Attorney General, he would have set out on an ambitious program. Well, to find out what had happened, well, he did, but privately. He did so privately, he couldn't do it in his official capacity under those circumstances where he well understood that Lyndon Johnson and no doubt J. Edgar both had been profoundly involved, and indeed they were the two most important players in taking out JFK and covering it up.
Did you ever look into Jada's fate?
I think she had a very short lifespan thereafter, as I recall, Gary.
Yeah, I think she was hanging in a hotel. So it's really dangerous this time, and a lot of people were speaking the truth because they were really trying to do their American duty, and what a joke that was. All right, the feds are meeting with key Justice Department officials real soon.
The city officials of Dallas, the city police officials, Police Chief Just Curry, and federal agents are meeting at this hour at the chief's office and are awaiting the arrival from Washington of a key Justice Department official, apparently to piece together the strange facts and the multitude of rumors and suspicious stories.
Who was the key justice official, and what do you think they were talking about?
Well, I know, Gary. This would not have been J. Edgar himself, of course. A key official of the Justice Department could have been Nicholas Katzenbach, however, who drafted a memorandum already on Sunday stating that the public needed to be reassured that Lee Oswald was a lone assassin, that there was no conspiracy, and even though his background seems a little too blatant, having defected to Russia, married a Russian woman, and then returned to the United States, that he thought perhaps a report from the Federal Bureau of Investigation would be sufficient given the stature and respect of the American people for the FBI. But of course, it was a monstrous deceit and deception, sad to say, and no one was going to get anywhere. There wasn't going to be a legitimate investigation. The only parties who have sought to solve this crime, with the sole exception of Jim Garrison, who had as many as 8 or 9 CIA agents infiltrating his own research group.
Yeah, just like our JFK community does.
There you go, Gary. Really, the parallel's quite striking, isn't it? Because, I would say today, anyone who continues to insist that the Zapruder film has not been altered or that Oswald was not in the doorway,
they're messing with you.
It's really revealing that they are defending the indefensible, and since it's not a rational thing to do in terms of the evidence with respect to your beliefs, they must be doing so for other reasons in order to explain the deviation between the stance they're taking and what the evidence shows.
It's heartbreaking, actually. All right, well, if you remember the Honeymooners episode, sometimes Jackie Gleason would go, hamana, 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 in front of Alice. Well, this is Henry Wade doing the hamana, hamana.
It's unusual for Jack Ruby to be in that crowd.
I don't pass on that. Unusual for being in that crowd? I don't. Well, I haven't been here since last night, so I don't know anything about Liberty.
The story that Oswald and Ruby were previously appointed?
I think I heard it on radio or something, but I don't know anything about it.
Did we have a chance to talk to Ruby?
I have not talked with... No, sir, I have not talked with either one of them.
Well, will we get a chance to talk to her?
I don't know anything about that. This was entirely about going over the evidence that I thought some of you would want.
You know Ruby before this?
No, sir. Saw him in this very same room
Friday night when we had the defendant up here.
There was a steak party for the Texas Bar Association in the Adolphus Hotel. Were you there?
No, sir, I wasn't there. As a matter of fact, if some of you will recall, he asked a question from out here in the audience, or answered a question. He's standing right back here, and I didn't know who he was. I thought he was a member of the press, and he told me as we walked out of here that he was a nightclub operator here.
What question did he ask?
What?
What question did he ask?
I don't remember, but maybe it was an answer, but he said something.
Remember it was Friday night when I asked you to do an interview with me on the phone, and you had another call, and Ruby was hanging around in the background. You were on the phone, and I said, and then you had to go away, and I asked Ruby, because he seemed to me like a detective. He seemed to be all over this place. I said, would you see if you could get him on the phone? Over to here now. And he went around, and he got you, and he brought you over to my telephone.
It might have been where he told me who he was. I didn't know who he was either. When I think someone here answered that question in that he answered a question. Somebody asked something, and he answered it back there, and I don't know what it was. I think it was some question about a street or an address or a name or something.
You look to me like you're a good friend. I don't know what conspiracy.
The reporter said he looked like you were good friends with him when he got the phone from you. Just amazing. Henry Wade.
Yeah, Henry Wade had to know Jack Ruby, as I observed. And, of course, the question was where Wade made a faux pas and said that Oswald had been associated with the Free Cuba Committee, which, of course, would have meant that he was an anti-Castro, anti-communist, when in fact they were seeking to portray him as a pro-Castro communist sympathizer, which is when Jack Ruby called out, no, it was the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and Henry Wade was corrected thereby. And of course, as we all know, when Lee was in New Orleans, he was the only member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee.
Mm-hmm. Let's hear it one more time. Looked like you two were friends.
Looked to me like you're a good friend. I don't know.
Looked to me like you were good friends. All right, Ruby, using the word conspiracy before the CIA turned it into what it is today. All right, Dr. Fetzer.
And if you knew the true facts, you'd be amazed at it. In what way? It'll be proven in a few days later what the charges will be filed against me, plus the fact of the assassination. A complete conspiracy against me, right?
The only thing I can say, what is your name, and I'll know how to do it. Harry Kennedy.
Well, of course, Jack Ruby was speaking the truth. I mean, a conspiracy only requires two or more individuals acting in concert to bring about an illegal end. They're as common as apple pie. In fact, the most frequently prosecuted crime in the United States is conspiracy to ABCD. Most American conspiracies are economic. WorldCom, Enron are a couple of cases that come to mind. But the CIA, evidently consulting with some very shrewd social psychologists, realized that they needed to find some kind of semantic club to assail those who were suggesting that the government might have had anything to do with the death of JFK, and began turning the term conspiracy theory or conspiracy theorist into a four-letter word. It's most unfortunate, Gary, because frankly you can't understand the nature of events in the world today if you don't understand conspiracies. An article I would recommend to everyone, the first I wrote, my first serious article about 9/11 is entitled Thinking About Conspiracy Theories, 9/11 and JFK, where I go through the four steps or stages of scientific reasoning, namely puzzlement, speculation, adaptation, and explanation, and apply them to JFK and to 9/11. And, anyone who is serious in their thinking, apply scientific principles to complex and controversial cases like these, deserves to be appreciated as a conspiracy analyst or as a conspiracy realist. We have to overcome the kind of psychological condemnation that has been associated with the phrase conspiracy theorist, because they have deliberately spun the word theory into the weak sense of a mere rumor, speculation, or guess, so that anyone who's thinking about the possibility of a conspiracy is merely conjecturing or spitballing, when there's a far more serious sense of the term associated with Einstein's theory of relativity, Newton's theory of gravitation, Darwin's theory of evolution, in terms of which a theory is an explanatory hypothesis, an empirically testable explanatory hypothesis. So my work in relation to JFK, 9/11, and a host of these other issues has been dedicated to taking their standing from theories in the weak sense to theories in the strong sense. And I'd offer as a perfect illustration the article Reasoning about Assassinations, which I presented at Cambridge and then published in an international peer-reviewed journal about the magic bullet theory, where I demonstrate that simply by establishing where JFK was hit in the back, it's possible to prove the existence of a conspiracy to bring about his death. So I recommend those two resources for those who are serious in wanting to understand how to apply scientific principles to these very complicated and controversial cases.
Straight out of the RAND Corporation in Los Angeles, the CIA's most successful project, I would have to say, is the word conspiracy theorists. It's been the most effective. I just have to give it to them, as evil as they are. All right, now we have the famous clip of Jack Ruby saying it's in high places. Jack, are these people in high places?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. In other words, I'm the only person in the background that knows the truth pertaining to everything relating to my circumstances.
Do you think it'll ever come out?
No, because unfortunately, the people that have so much to gain and have such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
Now, these people are in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
Dr. Fetzer, I've been waiting a long time for you to respond to this clip.
Well, Gary, I've often commented on what Jack Ruby was saying to reporters at the time, including that if someone else had been vice president, this would never have happened. He even offered Adlai Stevenson as an illustration. And what bothers me is that there are some students of JFK who simply aren't willing to acknowledge the abundance of evidence that implicates Lyndon Johnson as a pivotal player. I mean, go back to Madeline Duncan Brown, who had an affair with Lyndon that began in 1948. She bore him a son, Stephen, in 1950, not his only child out of wedlock, but his only male offspring. She was invited to the ratification meeting the night before at the home of Clint Murchison Sr. She thought initially it was in honor of J. Edgar, who was frequently there and was present that evening. She remembered that Richard Nixon had been driven out by a prominent Republican leader who worked in the same bank building where she was a young advertising executive. She remembered George Brown, Brown and Root Heavy Construction. When the Vietnam War went down, Brown and Root was given $1 billion to dredge a new port at Cam Ranh Bay, even though Vietnam has many magnificent natural ports, and I'm quite sure it wasn't necessary. John J. McCloy was there, former High Commissioner to Germany, former Chief Executive Officer, Chase Manhattan Bank, no doubt representing the interests of the Fed. H.L. Hunt was there, and late in the evening, Lyndon showed up, and all these heavy hitters disappeared into a boardroom for 15 or 20 minutes. And when they broke up and Lyndon strode toward her, Madeline expected he was going to whisper sweet nothings in her ear. Instead, he told her in a hateful tone of voice that he wasn't going to have to put up with embarrassment from those Kennedy boys any longer, that was not a threat, that was a promise. And, of course, 6 weeks later, during a rendezvous in the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, Texas, she confronted him with rumors rampant in Dallas at the time that he'd been involved in the assassination, and Lyndon blew up at her and told her the oil boys and the CIA decided that Jack had to be taken out. We get confirmation from Billy Saul Estes, who told William Raymond, a French investigative journalist that Lyndon had sent Cliff Carter, his chief administrative assistant, down to Dallas to make sure all the pieces were in place, all the arrangements were in place for the assassination. He knew Cliff Carter and Mac Wallace up close and personal. Mac was Lyndon's personal hitman, murdered a dozen people for Lyndon, including one of his own sisters. It's reinforced by Bar McClellan. And Billy has published that in a Texas legend, modestly named after himself. Bar McClellan was working for the most powerful judge in Texas who assisted Lyndon in the planning of the assassination, and it's covered up, and published a book entitled Blood, Money, Power, with his revelations, another piece of the puzzle. Then we have, of course, E. Howard Hunt, who, on his deathbed, he actually lived longer, but at the time he thought he was going to die. He enumerated the chain of command that's having gone from Lyndon to Cord Meyer to David Atling Phillips to William Harvey to David Sanchez Morales, and of course below them the mechanics, the various shooters who appear to have been supervised by Edward Lansdale and George Herbert Walker Bush. We have the new book by Roger Stone, about the man who killed Kennedy, the case against LBJ, a very nice piece of work. And what's interesting about him is that he comes from the political right. He was an advisor to Richard Nixon. He helped George W. Bush steal the election in Florida. And, of course, we have the masterpiece by Phil Nelson, LBJ, mastermind of JFK's assassination, where he now has a new book out, which I'm reviewing with an advanced copy entitled From Mastermind to the Colossus. And it really explains how LBJ had sandbagged a whole lot of, progressive proposals that Jack had wanted to be passed until he could assume the presidency and then take credit for Jack Kennedy's proposals, including, of course, the Civil Rights Act, 1964. I mean, this was a very devious, dangerous man, by far the most interesting figure ever astride the American political stage, because he had such great strength both for good and for evil. But, Jack Ruby is remarkable because he's one among the very few of the conspirators who actually had a conscience. And it was, to me, acutely disappointing when Earl Warren refused to take him back to Washington, where he felt he could testify without his life being in danger, because he appreciated that he was at great risk in Dallas. And, of course, he later believed he'd been injected with a rapid-acting cancer, and the fact is he had been. So, I think Jack wasn't all bad. He was certainly the local arrangements chairman for the Mafia in relation to the assassination, but, things didn't play out very well for him.
I think this next clip will back up exactly what you're saying. He's saying that if Adlai Stevens would have been the vice president, our beloved Jack would have never been assassinated.
I mentioned about Adlai Stevens. If he was vice president, there would never have been an assassination of our beloved President Kennedy. Well, the answer is the man in office now.
The answer is the man in office. Go, Dr. Fetzer.
Well, that's exactly right. Who's responsible? The man in office now. Now, many students at JFK still fail to draw the crucial distinction between the sponsors, the individuals and organizations who wanted JFK out and Lyndon in, primarily for reasons of policy, the facilitators who were Lyndon in getting it done and Edgar in covering it up, and then the mechanics whom I've already mentioned, the 6 or more shooters and their supervisors and coordinators. But where the sponsors included the CIA, because Jack was threatening to shatter it into 1,000 pieces, the Joint Chiefs, because he had not invaded Cuba, contrary to the unanimous recommendation. He'd signed an above-ground test ban treaty with the Soviet Union against their unanimous opposition, and now he was going to pull our forces out of Vietnam, where they felt a stand had to be taken against the expansion of international godless communism. The anti-Castro Cubans, of course, wanted revenge, and it appears that a key figure in the shooting was in the Dow text, being supervised by George H.W. Bush, an anti-Castro Cuban by the name of Nestor Tony Escadro, who was using a Mannlicher Carcano to fire 3 shots it was the only unsilenced weapon used to create the acoustical impression that only 3 shots had been fired, where he had 2 misses with 1 hit. One miss hit the distant curbing and injured the bystander, James Tague, and another missed JFK and hit the chrome strip above the windshield. But the third, after William Greer pulled the limousine to the left into a halt, hit JFK in the back of the head, which is when he slumped forward. Jackie eased him back up and was looking him right in the face when he was hit in the right temple by a frangible exploding bullet fired from the north end of the triple underpass by, it appears, Frank Sturgis, which set up shockwaves that blew his brains out the back of his already weakened cranium and impacted with Bobby Ray Hargis, who was riding there. So, Jack Ruby is just a very interesting guy, and it simply dumbfounds me that there are some out there who are willing to dismiss this whole mountain of evidence I've just described. I had over 100 conversations with Madeline Duncan Brown, for example, including having lunch with her in Dallas, including interviewing her for JFK Lancer in 1999, as I recall, which you can still obtain by going to JFK Lancer. She was the real deal. She spoke the truth, and I really find it astonishing that there's anyone who should question her veracity. Connie Kritzberg, who was a reporter for the Dallas Morning News, has confirmed everything that Madeline told us. Nigel Turner vetted her and her story for the final segment of The Men Who Killed Kennedy, The Guilty Men, including tracking down the chauffeur who had driven Richard Nixon to that ratification meeting the night before and the chef who had prepared the hors d'oeuvres. So it just troubles me. It's as though these people think you're going to get, choir angels. You're going to get, acolytes who are going to tell us what happened to JFK. The people who knew Lyndon Johnson best up close and personal were quite a varied lot, but there are many among them who were willing to speak the truth about it, and that includes those I've been enumerating here.
All right. We've got revelations by Mark Lane about Nixon and Ruby.
Judge Burt Griffin was one of the legal counsel for the Warren Commission. He now feels that the commission was duped by the CIA.
I feel betrayed.
I confronted Burt Griffin, who was one of the lawyers for the Warren Commission, with this column. He'd never heard of it. It was in a program in Cleveland. We were on a television show together, and I said, "What about this?" He'd never heard of it. And I said, "Well, how could you not know about it?" He said, "I didn't know about it." I said, "Well, what was your..." He said, "Well, my area was Jack Ruby." I said, "Okay. Did Ruby testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee?" He said, "Not to my knowledge." I said, "Well, here's the exhibit. UAC release for Jack Ruby to testify. It's stationery of the Department of Justice. FBI, sworn to by a staff assistant, the 24th of November, 1947. And it says that Mr. Jack Rubenstein of Chicago, noted as a potential witness, should be not be called for open testimony in the hearings. It should be closed testimony. You know why it had to be closed? Because he was an informant. This is what it said. He's providing information functions for the staff of Congressman, are you ready? Congressman Richard M. Nixon, Republican of California. Jack Ruby worked for Richard Nixon in 1947 and testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and the lawyer for the Warren Commission in charge of Jack Ruby's background never heard about that until I showed it to him about 2 weeks.
All right, take us out, Dr. Fetzer, on this week's show.
Well, there's a plus and a minus here. I mean, it's absolutely true that Jack Ruby, who was hired as a private investigator for Richard Nixon's staff when he was on the House Un-American Activities Committee, he was then going by the name of Jack Rubenstein. He did work for Nixon, whose middle name was, of course, Milhouse, Richard Milhouse Nixon. But it's false that he testified for the HSCA. He died on 3 January 1967 in Dallas while he was awaiting trial from that injection with a rapid-acting cancer. The HSCA conducted its investigations 10 years later, 1976-77, and published its final report in 1979. So for some reason, we're getting a mix of the true and the false here about Jack Ruby, but I reiterate, he was the most interesting fellow, and some students at JFK really ought to pay a whole lot more attention to Jack Ruby than they have done up to this point today.
You ought to be paying a lot more attention to Dr. Fetzer because he's not playing around. This is The Real Deal, and this is show 22. We have done our best this week in the search for truth in JFK community. Talk to you next week, Dr. Fetzer.
You got it, Gary. Thank you so much.